Welcome to the Madness and Grace podcast, where we explore the connection between mental health and faith. I'm Dr. Matthew Stanford, neuroscientist, author, and mental health advocate.
And I'm Dr. Madeline Stiers, therapist and trauma researcher. We're so glad you're joining us today. Each week, we have authentic conversations about personal stories, we share professional insights, and explore the meaningful ways faith can influence mental well-being.
Whether you're seeking comfort, understanding, or simply a new perspective, we're here to journey with you. Thanks for tuning in. Now let's dive into today's conversation. Hello and welcome. We've got a great discussion topic today. We're going to talk about religious delusions and hallucinations, particularly in the context of faith. This is a topic that's particularly interesting to me. I have a lot of experience working with individuals that have had religious delusions and hallucinations, and a lot of can be very not only personally frightening for the individual who might be experiencing them, but for people of faith they may engage. Because oftentimes when people are experiencing religious delusions, hallucinations, they will engage faith communities specifically to try to kind of figure out what's going on, or because they believe they have a special revelation from God or some divine being. So as we begin, maybe Maddie, you could talk a little bit about some of these you may have run into some of your clients, or what we may have seen at the Hope and Healing Center, or anything you'd like to talk about.
I was going to say, I've got something to say, but it's not that. I think before we jump into it, it's important. A lot of our listeners may have an understanding of what delusions and hallucinations are, but I think a lot of people may hear that but not actually know exactly what it is. So when we think about psychosis, it's the combination of delusions and or hallucinations, right? So delusions are the thoughts that go along with someone who might be experiencing some sort of psychosis. So you could have, thoughts that are persecutory, someone's, the belief that something is trying to harm you, grandiose. You may have some bizarre delusions, thinking that people have implanted something in your body, or someone is out to get you. There's a whole bunch of different things. Religious delusions, right? So like belief, we'll get in more into this, but the belief that you may have some special relationship to your religious beliefs or whatnot. And then, so thoughts are the delusions, and they typically are bizarre. So thoughts, and that's the clinical term, right? Like thoughts that not every day someone may be having. And then hallucinations are related to your senses. So it's when you're seeing something that other people do not see. When you're hearing something, so hearing voices that other people don't hear, you may be tactile, you might be feeling something. So it's typically associated with your senses. But oftentimes someone who's experiencing psychosis, which is what the term is for all of this, they're experiencing hallucinations and delusions. So I just wanted to kind of outline that a little bit. Did you want to add anything to it?
No, only that, in the context of a delusion, it's not just that a person believes something that you don't believe. It's that they have a false belief that is not shared by others, and there is clear evidence to the contrary. That's the kind of thing. So it's not just that you believe X and they believe Y. It's not a disagreement. I mean, it literally is a false belief. They may believe that they are, and I may give some examples as we go through. I have on more than one occasion had an individual I work with that believed that they were Jesus. Or they may believe that they have superpowers, or that they have special knowledge, or that's, like you said, someone's out to some shadow organization is out hunting them, because of something in the government. So it's not that they just disagree with you, or even that they have an extreme belief. I think that's a mistake I've seen before with families, that their loved one had an extreme belief and they thought, well, this is crazy, it's delusional. Well, no, it's just an extreme belief. It's just you don't agree with it. This is a false belief. And so I think that that's just kind of an important point.
Yeah, I think when it starts to become pathological from an extreme belief to pathology, is it's actually not based in any sort of reality. Yeah,
and really, again, like I said, I've done a lot of studies and worked with a lot of people who have had different type of psychotic disorders and were experiencing religious delusions and hallucinations. And really, for instance, in schizophrenia, it can vary from 20 to 60% of schizophrenics that are assessed will be showing religious delusions or hallucinations. I mean, religious delusions and hallucinations are very common. And more often than not, these are people of faith who themselves now have a serious mental illness, and it's just manifesting in this kind of bent kind of version of their faith. I remember the very first time that I was asked a question about this by a student, at a graduate student. We were doing a study working with a group of male substance abusers that were living in a faith-based substance use facility. And so they were receiving an integrated approach to care there, and we were working with them unrelated to other things. But she came into my office one day and she said, I need you to explain to me the difference between someone telling me that they are hearing from God and someone who has a religious delusion or hallucination. Because using that kind of language is very common in the men that were in this facility, because that was very common in the kind of the theology and the understandings of this religious group that ran this. And so it's a great question. It's a great question. How do you know if someone is having a religious delusion? How do you know if they're having a religious hallucination? In that instance, it would be hallucination. I'm hearing from God. I grew up in a faith tradition, a Christian faith tradition, a mainline denomination that I can honestly tell you that there probably wasn't a time in my entire, and I went to a religious school that was part of that faith tradition. There wasn't a single time I ever heard someone say that they had heard from God. That was just not common in that tradition. Now, the church I go to now and the tradition it comes from, people think you're weird if you probably don't say that. So, anyway, it's just kind of I think that we're in a gray area for a lot of people here, because people will describe kind of mystical experiences. And when do we cross a line for pathology?
Yeah, and you definitely have to take into consideration the sociocultural interpretations that are within that individual's background, because there are different groups of individuals, not just religious groups, but cultural groups, that the way that they have religious experiences might look very out of the norm.
Very different.
To kind of like the standard mainstream Christian denomination.
Culturally different. All kinds of differences. So.
Right. And so that's one of the things that you think about when you're, as a clinician, working with someone who may be saying things and you're going, okay, well, this doesn't align with maybe like what I've been exposed to.
But you really do have to, kind of hold that back and say, well, what is it with this person? I use one of the things, I actually kind of came up with a 4-point of kind of test. This isn't some validated.
Is it validated?
No, but when that student asked me that, so I thought, okay, well, I'm going to look around, I'm going to figure out something. Okay. And so what I came up with was this. Okay. So here's your 4 things that you can kind of, and why don't we do this? I'm going to give you the 4 points here, and then I'm going to give you some examples that I know you've never heard me give you before, and then I'll just have you kind of react to these. These are examples of actual people that I've worked with. So here are the 4 kind of litmus tests. Is the experience consistent with Scripture? Okay, so is the person saying that God has given me powers and I can fly now? There's a delusion of grandeur there. Okay. Does it align with the character of God in the Scriptures, or that's taught by this person's faith tradition? So is it, if the person said, I believe that, God is telling me I need to go over to some country and I need to kill everyone, is that consistent with what would be? And then is the experience consistent with the individual's past or present faith tradition? That's usually the big one right there. And so the person's in a faith community that maybe doesn't believe in kind of audible revelation from God or things like that, or manifestations of, but is it consistent with what they teach? Now that's where it becomes very, very difficult. And I'll give you some ideas of how, in some sense, kind of some of these people, they end up able to hide inside of churches and their problems aren't really recognized. And then finally, is the person at peace, or are they distressed and confused about what's going on? Normally, what I find is that that's also that those last 2 are the big ones, and so they're usually very distressed if it's inconsistent, and usually if it gives them a lot of peace, then it typically usually is something that's pretty normal. So it might be not normal for you, but for them. So there are the 4. So consistent with Scripture, align with the character of God, kind of traditional teaching on that. consistent with the individual's past or present faith tradition? And is the person at peace, or are they in distress as a result of the hallucination or delusion? So let me give you a couple of different ones that I've run into over the years, and these vary widely. Okay, so I'll give you the first one I ever engaged ever in my whole career. So I was working in an ER and emergency room, for those of you who don't know what ER is. And this gentleman, really in the middle of the night, brought his sister in. And they're both adults, and she is in a very jovial mood, very excited. She's wants to talk to everybody, and we get her back in the room. And so they were from Taiwan, but he lived here in the U.S., and she had come over to visit him. And so he said, I thought she could make it. She ran out of medicine. I thought she could make it. She's supposed to go back this week, and it would only be a week, but she's completely lost it. And so she was schizophrenic, and she had not taken her medicine now in almost a full week. So she, we got her in the room, and then we went out, and when I pulled the curtains back and went back in the room, she was standing on the bed with her arms out to the side like she was on a cross. And she said, I am the Lord, and I love you. And so then she started running around the ER, grabbing all the men in a private place and saying, I love you, and saying she was Jesus over and over. I mean, she absolutely, and her poor brother, he was in so much distress, but she absolutely believed that she was Jesus. And I think that's the difficult thing for people to understand, is that she's not faking. She really believed that. So that's the first one I ever encountered. She was having a religious delusion of grandeur, is what we would call that, because she believed that she was Jesus returned. So got any thoughts on that one?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's really sad to hear that, people, it can seem funny, people want to giggle about it, and but the reality
is, in the middle of a busy ER, it
especially
really
if you
was
think,
looked at that way.
If you think that they're faking it, or they're putting on some show, I can see, but it is really sad for that person that their life has been totally dominated by this illness, and then the family is impacted by it, and to go just a week without the medicine, we know that what impact that has. Even the family, thought, oh, maybe she can make it, and it's just such serious mental illness is a serious illness. Right.
And she was in a very, that's the other thing. I think in this
instance,
it hard. A super happy mood. I mean, smiling and joyful. And she was at great peace at what she was saying. Now, when you looked at her brother,
he was
you could clearly see this wasn't a good thing. He was just a mess.
I think that's the last point of your 4-point system that you just made up.
That's not what worked. That's another 4 points.
I think this kind of goes to the last point that you had of the distress. But what I've seen a lot is the delusions and some of the hallucinations that they do cause some level of distress for the individual. But a lot of what I see is it's the fact that people in their life don't believe them that causes distress. So it's not the distressing point isn't that I believe I'm Jesus, right? It's that you don't believe I'm Jesus.
Right.
And my loved ones are saying that I'm sick, but no, I'm fine.
Not that I'm faking, that it's a joke.
Right, that I'm faking it. Right. Yeah. So there's a flaw in your 4-point system. I'm just kidding.
Oh, no. That's why there are 4 points, because it's
no. Yeah. And I think
with the delusions, we really have to remember these people, they live in a different reality. They truly believe these things. So if they tell you, if they're delusional and they're telling you, as a client once told me, that they believed that his shadow organization from the government was going to kill her adult children, and that her neighbor was a CIA operative who came into her house at night and put things in her neck through surgery, and that's why she kept hearing these voices saying these things. I mean, she showed clear and obvious fear. I mean, there was no doubt. She was terrified. You can't just tell that person, well, that's not true.
Right. I mean, and this is the thing is, one time someone came in from off the street, walked into my office. She was a black woman in her maybe 50s or 60s, and she proceeded to take her clothes off in my office and show me the marks that there weren't any marks, but the marks on her body from the abuse that she was going through from this family that was holding her. And she believed that she was being abused, but she also believed that she was a 15-year-old white child. Right. And people go, "Wah, ha, 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 that's silly." And while the contrast is so different there, she believes that. And how do you, that's where families and faith communities and people that interact with someone struggling from psychosis get so stuck, is like, what do you do? How do you, and what we see happen, and you may be able to attest to this too, is what we typically see is people will try to convince them otherwise. Like, let me read scripture to you to prove that what you're saying isn't accurate. Or let me try to talk some sense, quote unquote, sense into you. And the reality is what you're saying, these people firmly believe it. They are struggling from an illness, and arguing with them is not going to work.
Reason is not the way out of this. And so I often say, you can't reason with an unreasoned mind. And so you're not even in the same dimension as these people. So really, in the world they live in, this kind of altered reality, this is a fact. And because their brain is dysfunctional. And so I think they're not going to think their way out of it, and you're not going to convince them. And a therapist that's not what a therapist does. We don't go, okay, I'm going to give you this perfect 8-point argument of why you're not a 15-year-old white girl and you've never been abused by a family that's not really holding you.
And suddenly you will understand.
Right. That's not how it happens. And so in a minute, we'll get to some ideas of kind of how families and ministers might help with this. But I'll give a few more examples. Here's one that I think is a little less extreme, perhaps, is the one I just gave. And this is the result of a psychosis as a result of a medication. Okay. And so when I was a professor at a university, and I was also doing some of the things we do now here at the Hope Healing Center, and I was involved with a faith community there, I got a phone call on a Saturday from a college student, and he said, the people at my church told me to call you. I'm having some problems with my roommate. We just got back from a mission trip a little less than a week ago. It was a spring break mission trip. We went to Central America, okay, and so a place in Central America. And he, for the last 3 days, has been getting worse and worse. He will not eat. He will not drink water. He's on his knees in a very uncomfortable position in his room. He has stayed in that position for as long as 6 hours with his hands up in the air, looking at the ceiling, praying. And he says if he doesn't do this, that he's concerned that some very bad things will happen, that God is telling him to do this. And every day, he says that God is sending him to a different country to be a missionary. So he has begun making plans to drop out of school, sell everything he has, and fly to these countries. He's looking into that. And he is not willing to talk to his family or anybody like that because God is telling him to do this. And so I'm like, okay. Luckily, on the surface, that just sounds like, okay, this guy just had a psychotic break, right? And I said, well, how was he 2 weeks ago before he went on the mission trip? It was fine. He's never ever had a problem. How long have you known him? Well, we've lived together for 2 years. Okay. Does he have any psychiatric problems? Not that I know of. I've never had any problem before. Has he been doing okay in school? Yeah, he does great in school. He said, I said, what about on the mission trip? He goes, I just thought he was just having a really intense religious experience. He just was really saying how in touch with God he was. And I said, okay, where did you go again? And he told me, and I said, did you take malaria medication before you went? And he said, yep, we're just finishing up. You take it for a week after you get back too. And I said, well, that's it. So the malaria medication they're on, psychosis, is a rare but not uncommon, I should say, actually, symptom or side effect. And so I said, what you need to do, you need to put him in the car, you need to drive him down, you need to get his bottle of meds, drive him down to the ER, give him to the ER doctor, and tell him everything you just told me. So that's what I did. And then they boosted him up with some antipsychotics. He, of course, no, it's not that. It's not these meds. I'm really having an experience here. And so got him off the meds, got him on some antipsychotics. And So that was kind of an interesting one. I'll add in the ending of that in a few minutes because it's another aspect of that. So any thoughts on that one? That one had nothing to do with mental illness. It just had to do with medication that had a bad side effect.
Yeah, I think that a lot of clinicians, even psychiatrists, might have been, because this was a college age student.
Yeah, he's right in the
Right at the age.
He's right in
Yeah.
there. Yeah.
So I think a lot of people would have missed that and said, oh, this is potentially schizophrenia or some sort of psychotic disorder. This is, and like to throw a family into, kind of some level of crisis, and that. This is why I think you say this, I always say it. Someone comes into my office, their loved one, them, whoever, struggling with whatever sort of mental health distress. I go to your PCP,
Right.
Get your physical, go get things checked out. Because if it's something physical causing this, not your brain, but something, medication, it's much easier, hopefully, to address. So we want to start there. Yeah, interesting.
Now here's the more difficult side of that story and more difficult side of this in general. And that is, in this young man, although I don't see this in most psychoses, but some, he very much remembered all of the experience that he had, the spiritual experience.
Interesting. Yeah.
And so as he became less and less delusional, I ended up talking with him several times because he was very confused because he felt that the experience had been spiritually impactful in his life and meaningful. And he didn't like the idea that maybe it wasn't quote unquote real, that, that really wasn't God talking to him. And he felt like he was closer to God as a result of this event, even at the point when he was fully back to reality and no longer delusional. And so I think that, that's a first caution I like to give to the listeners today, is that we don't want to just dismiss every one of these as if they're pathological at every level. I do believe that these, and I have seen, obviously, these experiences be spiritually meaningful to people. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying that I want people to live in a delusional state where they don't understand reality and those kind of things. But, and I certainly believe they should get treatment for these. These are a problem. But they have to be contextualized in some way. And this young man, I said, look, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. If God used that in your life and you find that to be spiritually impactful and meaningful for you, fantastic. It wasn't a fake experience. It really happened. I think we have to be careful to just say, just be dismissive. Anything you learned or felt you learned, or that's just all, that's gone. It's pathology.
Yeah. I think a lot of people would have a hard time holding those two in the same space, though. This is...
Oh, I agree. And that's why we're having this conversation. So we're trying to talk about things people don't. So here, let me give you some do's and don'ts and have you react to that. And these are for our listeners in the sense of, so someone shows up, in a book I wrote a story about a buddy of mine. He was a pastor and, having like a Wednesday night service, and a guy shows up in the back. I kind of giggle because I'm not giggling at the person. What I'm giggling is the response of the people. They freak out, okay, because they just can't handle anything outside. This guy showed up and he said he was Jesus. He was back. He went right to the front of the church to tell everybody during the service, and he sat down in the front row. And so they're just going crazy, like, oh, this is demonic. This is a scary thing. And so they don't really try to evaluate the situation. So what are some do's and don'ts here? I think number one, I think you have to listen compassionately and with curiosity. I think you have to say, okay, well, that's really interesting. Let's figure out what's going on here. I know you and I have a lot of training and skills, and we can kind of pick things apart, and they don't really kind of get to us. But just if somebody tells you they think they're Jesus, don't just immediately, and I know they're not Jesus. Okay, don't me just qualify that. I know they're not. You're not trying to figure out whether they really are. But you don't know why they're saying that. Okay. And so it might be interesting to figure out why they're saying that. I think another thing is, I think you should ask them how the experience feels. If they tell you that they're fearful because of what's happening, or are they joyful or whatever, I think encouraging them to get a medical examination and talk to a physician. It doesn't have to be a psychiatrist. It can just be a medical doctor. I mean, a physician, a primary care physician. I got it out there finally.
Yeah.
And then, I think getting trusted faith leaders involved to give some advice and some suggestions, I think that's always a good idea. But these have to be people that are aware of the situation. We're not going to just pray with somebody and this is going to go away. We're not going to just tell them, no, you're not Jesus. And they're going to go, okay, well, thank you for telling me I'm not Jesus. I also knew a guy who thought he was Napoleon. So it's not always Jesus. I mean, it's different. It's different people. So I think some don'ts are, you don't just dismiss the experience outright. As we've said, I think you never assume that all these visions or hallucinations or things that people are having, I don't think you ever assume that they're all from God. And I don't think you ever assume they're all pathological. I think you got to go in kind of very balanced. And I think really importantly, I think the response is not to isolate the person from everyone else or to rely solely on some kind of spiritual intervention, even though it has a spiritual context to it. I think we have to be real careful about all those. Would you add anything to that?
I think those were some great points. I think the other one that we kind of had mentioned is arguing with the person or trying to talk reason into to maybe avoid taking offense to some of the things that they may be saying.
That's a good point. That's a very good point.
But, our faith and our beliefs are important to us. And so for someone to come in and say, I'm Jesus, and people may be offended by that. And the reality is this person isn't trying to offend you. So I think going in with some curiosity, like you were talking about, and a grace-filled mindset of, what's going on and how can I support this person, and not taking it personally.
Right. Well, the examples that I gave so far, we've got the woman who had a delusion of grandeur, which that's called, where she believed that she was someone else, in that instance, Jesus. And then the second one would have been what's referred to as a command or commanding voices or command voice or command hallucination. So he's having an auditory hallucination because he was taking that medication, which is telling him to do something. So it was telling him to pray in a certain way. It was telling him that, he needed to go to these certain countries. And literally he had contacted the administration of the school and was going to withdraw from all his classes and stuff. So that was what finally put the roommate over the edge to actually call me. It wasn't the other stuff. It was that, because he knew that was wrong. That wasn't something.
You can't leave class.
You should talk to your family about that. It's like, no, God told me to do it. So I'm going to, it wasn't that he was praying for 6 hours a day on his knees with his hands up looking at the ceiling and all this kind of stuff. That within their very highly religious community, that was okay. So sometimes it can be pretty extreme. So,
and like you said, religious delusions and hallucinations are not uncommon. It's a category in and of itself, because it is extremely common, and how it presents itself. So the examples that we're giving today are not the only ways that it can present itself,
not at
right?
all.
And I've had a client who auditory hallucinations that the devil was on. Literal, viewed,
Absolutely.
could auditory and visual hallucinations of seeing a little devil on his one shoulder and a little angel on the other. And both of them had different voices and would talk to him and try to convince them to do good and bad things. And, and it was, this person kind of learned that maybe it wasn't totally real and was able to kind of live through the voices and live with the hallucinations. But every situation is going to look a little bit different or vastly different.
Right.
And so it's a category. It's not, this is exactly how it's going to present.
It can be so extreme, like obviously when someone says they're Jesus, that's pretty extreme. But it can be so extreme that it obviously sits out like a sore thumb in any faith tradition, in any faith community. But it also can be subtle enough because the faith community has what someone outside the faith community might say are more extreme views or understanding. And, I want to be careful how I say this, but for instance, for my charismatic brothers and sisters out there who have more kind of physical expressions of the spirit or more physically expressive worship and things like that, where the idea of visions or hearing from God be that audibly or just kind of more impressions and things that are very common within the discussion of the faith community. Somebody can very easily come into that faith community and be very much affirmed and actually have some type of mental health problem that's generating a lot of that. I've actually seen that happen. Now, usually, ultimately, the person's delusions and hallucinations get to a point where they're obviously they're extreme and they kind of stick out even within that faith community, but they're not as obvious. And so now I certainly want to say I'm not saying that people that have more expressive, worship and things like that have delusions or hallucinations. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that the more outwardly expressive your religion is, your faith is, the less likely you are to pick up on these things until they reach kind of a threshold. So just to kind of give you another couple of examples, probably one of the saddest ones I ever ran into was a gentleman that I work with that was in prison, and he was in prison with a not guilty by reason of insanity sentence or designation because he was schizophrenic and he became delusional, and he believed that God was calling him to be kind of a protector of people around him. And so when he saw a gentleman on the street that had a University of Alabama hat on, he believed that the A meant that was the Antichrist, and sadly, he murdered him. But right in the middle of everything, right in front of everyone, didn't try to get away, was very vocal about why he had done it, and he thought he was protecting people. Now, again, that's certainly not to say that people with delusions and hallucinations are violent. They're no more likely to be violent than anyone else. But in this instance, it was at that extreme. And I use that example because I really think it does help a person understand that this person truly believes this. It's kind of that age-old thing, like, what if you had a time machine, you went back in time and you met Hitler before 1939, what would you do? So would you do what a lot of people would do, or would you not, and knowing what was going to happen? In this instance, he really believed he was saving people because of that.
I try to, oftentimes, talking with family members or parents of an adult child who's kind of had the onset of some sort of psychosis. If you're new to the concept, there's some psychoeducation that goes into it. And so trying to help people understand that these people really, it is true for them. Like they believe it, like that example that you just gave. I usually tell parents, I go, well, imagine if you came into my office and you were telling me this, and I said, Matt, you don't have any children.
Right.
I know you think that, but these are all stories that you've created, and I know they bring you comfort, but they're just, you actually never had any children. You are married, but you don't have any children. And you'd be like, yeah, okay, you're like, that is not true. I mean, you'd kind of scoff at me and walk out, right? Mm-hmm. And the parents go, yeah, absolutely. And I go, so that is similar to you trying to explain to this person that their belief is not accurate. They're just going to say, you're absolutely wrong. There's no way you're going to change or shake this belief that I have right now. So that's one way. Another way that I use to help families understand, like the
well, as we get kind of close to the end here, I just kind of end on some positive thoughts, because I know this can be pretty depressing. These are very ill people, but we have treatments. First and foremost, I want to say that what's going on in these people's brains is a dysfunction. They have a chemical dysfunction in this instance. We're talking about something like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, maybe even very serious depression. It could be possible to have psychotic
borderline personality
disorder. Absolutely. And so we, there are treatments and there are effective treatments. And so it's very important to get that individual treatment. And then right along the lines of what you just said, it's not easy to get someone to treatment when they don't know or believe that they are ill, because they believe what they're hearing or seeing or thinking is factual and the truth. And so one of the things I have seen quite a bit here at the Hope and Healing Center that I find very encouraging, since we do use a faith-integrated approach to care for people with serious mental illness, is I've had more than one family that were able to get their loved one to come here to talk with me because they told them that I will talk to them about these religious views and beliefs and thoughts that they're having. And that's what I'm going to talk to them about. I'm not going to talk to them about their mental health, and I will happily talk to them about these things. And so they were able to get them to come here. And the fact that we sit on the campus of a faith community, our building is on that campus, makes it even more easy for them because, hey, look, you're going to this faith community, you're going to talk to this guy. And so I think that there's a lot of opportunity there. So if you do have a loved one who, or a person you're working with who has the religious delusions, hallucinations, they or lack awareness of their illness, they aren't getting any affirmation or connection because of these extreme views, they may be willing to talk to somebody about them from a faith perspective, not so that the person can convince them that they're wrong or right, but so that they can build a connection that begin then to move them in a direction for them to be able to begin to get healed. And so a relationship is how you move people around, really.
Absolutely.
And so you can't just tell somebody, hey, you're wrong and we need to go take some medicine.
Do what I say. Yeah.
Exactly. So what about, you got any final thoughts on helping direct your loved one or a person you're working with if you're a faith community leader?
I think relationship is the number one thing to think about is, and I guess I'm thinking from a provider sense, but, we've seen so much success with, months and months of someone who's not willing to take medication, and you focus on, you're not happy, right? Like happiness is not something you're experiencing all the time right now, right? Like you're upset, your family isn't believing you don't feel supported. Let's talk about getting you happy. So focusing on that, like as the core concept, and then slowly introducing the idea of medicine and what that might look like. And I've had great success with that as the kind of process to getting someone to even consider taking medication, even an antipsychotic or a mood stabilizer at low doses, and it helps them.
That's a scary thing.
Yeah. Yeah, if someone told me you have to take, knowing the side effects of it, someone told me you have to take mood stabilizer, I would say, I don't want to do that. You
make a good point. I mean, I'm not going to say that it doesn't exist, but I have never met a person that had religious delusions and hallucinations, lacked awareness of their illness, and were where they wanted to be in life.
That just said, yes, I will take medicine.
Right. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
You don't say, you need medicine for this. And they go, you're right, I should take that.
So start with something you both can agree on. You're not where you want to be in life. Or like you said, you're not happy. So how can I help you move
to be happy? Let's talk about that.
And you're not going to do that in one session.
No.
You're going to meet with this person a lot. You got to build a relationship. You got to build trust. Yeah. So that's what, that's our encouragement today to families and to individuals in ministry that may be working with someone. Because believe me, for you in ministry out there, or you that are volunteers in churches, people that have religious delusions, hallucinations, they are drawn to churches like magnets. Okay. Mm-hmm. And so, because they are looking for someone to have a conversation with them about what's going on in their mind. And the wrong answer the first time you talk to them is everything you just said is wrong. That's just not the right answer, because you will know that they are delusional. You will know that they're having hallucinations, and they are desperate to have someone begin to lead them back into the real world. And so you have a real opportunity, I think, but don't be scared. These problems are certainly not too big for God, and they're certainly not too big for you. If you need resources, we have them here at the Hope and Healing Center. We have also a lot of training here at the Hope and Healing Center through our Gateway to Hope University program. And I'll make sure that we put the link for that down in the notes related to this episode. And, I know this is a lot in 40 minutes or so, but this is one of those topics that probably happens more and is evident more in faith communities or associated with faith communities that we just never really talk about, because it's pretty scary for most people that aren't in mental health. So thanks for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you next time as we talk about mental health and faith.
Thanks for joining our conversation on this episode of the Madness and Grace podcast. If you found value in our discussion today, we'd love it if you'd subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts so you never miss an episode.
And if you enjoyed what you heard, please consider leaving us a rating and review. It helps others find these important conversations.
Sharing this podcast with friends and family members is also a wonderful way to extend hope to those who might be struggling with mental health concerns.
We'll be back next time with another candid conversation about madness and grace. See you then.